me. And we were invited to talk today to bring an international perspective to the question of research data and scholarly journals. And so today, my talk is going to be starting with a background and introduction, and actually covering some of the ground from the fantastic first talk that we've just heard. Second, I want to devote some time to the concept that there is a new data architecture or ecosystem being developed. And I want to do that by just really showing you some global trends in this area. And thirdly, I want to try and bring it back to a practical level. So as journal editors or journal owners, what are the implications for you, and how might you go about implementing change in your journal? So if we start with the background, I think it's always important to define what we're talking about. And so what is research data, or what are research data? And there are many different definitions, really as many as there are different fields of research. But I found that the OECD definition from 2007 is commonly cited, and I think it's quite a good one. And it defines research data as factual records, so numerical scores, but also textual records, images and sounds that are used as primary sources for scientific research and that are commonly accepted in that community, and it's necessary to validate research findings. And so there's some important concepts in that. I also want to point out that while we're talking about research data, that the materials behind research, the code and software being used by scientists, and the analytical techniques are also under increasing focus and are also part of this general discussion, I think, about research data. But importantly, as we've heard as well, that data underpins scholarly activity. And so it is an important thing to think about within the scientific process. And so why else is it important? Well, lately there has been this concept or thing called the reproducibility crisis. And so recently there was some recognition and increasing awareness that some of the research described in articles could not actually be reproduced. And this led to increasing demands that there be open availability of the inputs into this research. And so that goes to the methods, the materials, the data, and the code. And so by opening up the data and having it available, there should be some hopeful solution to this reproducibility crisis. At the same time, recently over the last 10, 15 or 20 or more years, there have been a fantastic and rapid development in the technological tools that underpin data. So the ability to host, to share, to link, to identify data, to cite it, promote, and mine it are all being very rapidly developed. And I will give a range of examples in the coming talk. One thing though, stopping the development of data is that it is a complex area. There's massive amounts of data, which in and of itself is hard to manage. There are different types of data, as many different types as there are different fields. There are ethics and privacy concerns, and also ownership and control issues. And so some of these issues need to be, solutions need to be found to these issues before we can go to a fully functioning system. But as we've heard in the previous talk, journals really are a key part of an integrated and functioning scientific system. They report the results, and so journals do play a very important part of the growing data system. If we just take a step back and look at a recent history of data for a bit more context, well, as you would know, there are thousands of specialist digital databases that have been developed over the past 30 years. Obviously, there are more databases for hundreds of years, but in terms of digital, past 30 to 50 years is what we're working with. And so these span the whole range of the scientific exercise through biology, climate, etc. One of the some of the issues though with databases, and often the data that is within them, is that they can be short-lived, they can be static and not updatable, they're not interoperable, which is a new word that's coming, which we'll be introduced to as well later. Data can be unlinked, or databases, no standardization. Data can be difficult to find, and sometimes the reported results are not able to be reproduced, or the data are not reusable. And journals do have some aspect to this in that many do publish supplementary materials, but the files within these supplementary materials are often having the characteristics that I've just described. But so then what would be the aims for a new data ecosystem? Well, really the flip side of the previous slide. And so ideally data should be able to be shared, it should be able to be archived or stored, it should be linked, there should be standardization as much as is possible, and it should be usable and reusable by other researchers. And also it needs to be then underpinned by ethical considerations. And so this will enable data to have a range of characteristics which would really then facilitate the scientific process, which is that data can be used, the people developing the data can be credited, and then they can also be cited. And so what are the drivers of change? It was very interesting that in the previous talk, we looked at top-down and bottom-up approaches. And so these talks are completely independent, but we've come to the same conclusion, really, that who or what is driving change. And I posit that it's both authors who want to enable better science, as well as funders and other bureaucrats that are issuing mandates that also are driving change in this area. And so the journals, in a way, are following the mandates of groups like the funders because they want to attract and retain authors. And so I think these top-down and bottom-up approaches are accelerating the developments, and it really is then based on a common understanding that good data is important for good science. So in the next part of this talk, I want to try and develop an argument that there is a growing data ecosystem or architecture, and there's many ways of trying to describe the developments in the research data area, and this is the one I chose. But so firstly, I think there's a growing conceptual foundation being developed to the research data area. And on top of this is a building technology and infrastructure set of tools and things. And alongside this, there is a lot of development in policy and standardizing policies around research data. Finally, then on top of that, and on top of these foundations, there are products being developed and implementations of research data, which are now being able to be done because of the foundational work that's occurred. So if we start then with global trends, and so what are some of the conceptual foundations? Well, I think one of them is reproducibility, which I've touched on, and the previous talker as well touched on open science. And open data and the availability of data is a big part of open science, as you can see in the blue square. I think also of importance are proposed changes to the assessment of researchers. And so it could be argued at the moment that researchers are judged in many ways by the impact factor of the journal that they're publishing in. However, there's been recent moves in this regard that it's not a fair or good way of judging researchers, but they should be judged more on the totality of the work they're doing. So the conceptual ideas that they have, the work and methods that they're undertaking and developing, the research data that they're making, and then also the outputs that they're putting out, the interpretation of that in terms of research articles. And this is summarized by an organization or an initiative called DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. And so there really is a big push, I think, to change the way that researchers are assessed. And in order to do that, we need to have a more sophisticated research data environment. One of the important elements that has been developed over the last few years are the FAIR principles. Now, these are really a conceptual construct, and there's no particular product as such, but really they were a very good summary, I think, of the aims for good data that I described earlier. And so the FAIR principles are data which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so there actually is a lot of ongoing debate about sometimes what all these terms mean, especially interoperable. But really what is important in terms of the interoperability of data is that it can be used and reused by different users in different contexts. And so this has been an important catalyst in summarizing these conditions of good data for the development of the research data ecosystem. Next, in terms of, well, what trends are there? Well, there's actually a great amount of work on building particular infrastructure around research data. So recently, there are a whole range of data organizations have been developed and launched, and I'll talk about them a little bit soon. There's also work on persistent identifiers, and you'd all be aware by now of the DOI, which is identifiers for articles and data, but also ORCID and the Research Organization Registry are going to be very important in being able to link data objects to the articles and then engendering the use and reuse of data. And there's also an example from industry called Scholix, which I want to quickly talk about in a next slide. But firstly, if we just look at the data organizations, well, what are they doing? Well, they're doing a whole range of things, and really very important in developing the actual databases for research data and the associated functionality around them. They're heavily involved in the underlying IT development, especially around the linking of data objects to other objects. They're involved in standards and policies around research data. Also, though, they're facilitating communication and promoting all these concepts we're talking about today, and also helping in the training. So a community awareness of the changes and the potential of research data really are very important in ensuring that it is taken up by the community. And so Scholix, what is this? Really, this is just an example. We don't have time today to really look into it, but Scholix stands for Scholarly Link Exchange, and it's a system, an initiative set up by a range of different organizations, which are on the right there, to try and link data objects to other things. And so the image on the left is a schematic of some sort of arrangement of this new ecosystem where we have journals publishing articles on the top left. We have data centers who are hosting data, and as well as the repositories, and then other organizations all putting objects into an ecosystem. So really, for them to be used and reused, they need to be linked and bidirectionally linked. And so all these organizations have come together to try and build a new technological infrastructure to help the scientific process. Now, this is really a hidden thing, and one would never see really Scholix and how it's operating, but things are now starting to be built on top of that. And one is called Scholix Explorer, and this is a front-end search engine, which has got a database, when I looked last, of more than 21 million articles, millions of data sets, and hundreds of millions of bidirectional links. And so really quite rapidly we're seeing a sophisticated development of infrastructure. If we move along into different aspects of these global trends, well, one part of sharing data is being able to host it, is to be able to archive it somewhere. And so there have been, as you can see from the figure, a great explosion in the number of databases being launched. And these fall into different categories, but we can generally categorize them as either general or specific. And so we heard a bit about JStage data from earlier. And so I think this is really an important development potentially for JStage journalists to be able to make their way into the research data area. There's also many specific databases, and I mean subject specific, Pangaea, JPost, GenBank, etc. Next in our assessment of the global trends, well, to have these new technologies, we need to also have the underlying technology developed. And so there is a lot of work going on in the XML development to enable links between the data and the articles. And so there's a range of different organizations, which I just illustrate here. But so Crossref, JATS4R, DataCite, and others are doing various things, such as developing XML for references. This is a very specific example, but there is a new dataset tag for references. Article structures are being developed, and so there are new XML tags for these DASs, which I will talk about soon, or data availability statements. there are also new citation conventions being developed. And so if we agree then that there's been a whole range of infrastructure developed, I also think at the same time that there's been a lot of policy development. So there's different ways of looking at this. And I think one way is to try and ask, well, what's the funder positions on data and data deposition? And so this figure from Sherpa Juliet, which is a JISC service, surveyed 162 funders from 7 countries, and 47% of funders in this sample require or encourage their fundees to deposit raw data. And so there is some movement certainly in this space from the funders. Another aspect then of policy development is actually the policy codification. And so there's been a lot of discussion in the community about the lack of standards around research data. And so the Centre for Open Science has developed what they've called the Transparency and Openness Promotion, or TOP guidelines. And so they've tried to make standards around a whole range of different elements: data citation, data materials, etc. And what they've done is also then allowed for different levels of stringency for journals. So journals can ask authors to disclose various things. Journals can ask authors to require things, or they can actually then verify. And I think this is an interesting development, because more than 5,000 journals have actually signed on to the concept behind this, which is that data and other aspects should be transparent and open. They haven't all adhered to the guidelines. And so potentially in response to this, the Centre for Open Science have now launched just this year something called the TOP factor, which is then evaluating journals' compliance with these guidelines. And so you can see here from different developments, there are different levels of development that are building on top of the former work. In terms of policy codification as well, I think the ethical considerations are very important and were a barrier to developing research data in the past. But in 2017, the ICJME released the data sharing statements for clinical trials, which laid out very well some of the elements that medical journals need to be careful with. Just this year and just last month, there was an article in Nature that described models for sharing to accommodate variable levels of risk in personal data. And so there is still work going on in this space. If we come to actual journals, so one of the developments is that there are new article features within a journal. And so many funders and then the journals following on from the funders are now publishing what's known as data availability statements, or DASs. And these are a short sentence about how and where data can be found with links to that data. So as I say, they're becoming required by many funders. And you can see 4 examples from 4 large publishers about the different types of statements that authors can make to declare information about the data in their article. And this is actually a new section at the end of each article, not unlike a disclosure statement or a conflict of interest statement. It becomes part of the article. A very important part then of sharing data is being able to then cite it. And this also goes back to the research assessment of researchers, the assessment of researchers, where the ability to cite data is also part of being able to share it. And so just some examples in this area, there's an organization called DataCite, which was launched in 2009. And this is very much like Crossref, that it provides DOIs for data, whereas Crossref does for articles. And so they're providing an underlying infrastructure there for researchers to be able to cite the data. In 2014, there was conceptual work done and a joint declaration of data citation principles was released. And then following on from this, in 1 or 2 years ago, a roadmap for implementation of data citation principles was released, and I have the reference there. But this then outlines how to implement data citation policies at journals. So you have a nice example here of foundational elements moving through to implementation and actually practical outcomes for journals. If we quickly take a look at global trends, and this really reflects some of the previous talk as well, that we have often a gap between the ideals that are being espoused and the actual practical implementation of them. But so one example here is with journal data policies. The STM Association has released some data from 11 publishers covering more than 12,000 journals. And of these journals, 58% do have a data policy for them. However, if we then look at, from the same data, the journals that actually have data availability statements, well, this is still only at 9%. So there is a gap between the policy initiatives and the actual implementation. If we quickly move on to another aspect, and that is of data journals. And so a data journal is a journal which primarily publishes articles that describe data sets. And we can try and get an understanding of this field by looking at the journals with the word data in them in the Web of Science or Scopus. And so this is showing there's almost 100 journals with the word data in the title. A recent paper did a survey and found 169 journals that publish data articles, of which 19 or more are pure data journals that are only publishing articles that describe data sets. And so this has been an interesting growth area and a facilitation then of the ability to publish data and get credit for it. I want to move now to aspects of authors. We need to understand what the authors are doing and thinking. And so the previous talk also described aspects of this, but I found an interesting 2019 study of UK researchers, and they were asked, how important is data sharing? And 86% of the respondents said fairly important or very important. And so we can ascertain that data sharing is an important thing for researchers. They were then asked, have you deposited your data? And 79% of respondents said no. So again, we're seeing a gap between some of the ideals and some of the actual practical implementations. Further to this, there's a new, there was a paper published quite recently describing a new service called OddPub. And this is a text mining algorithm to detect data sharing in articles. And so they randomly sampled 792 articles from PubMed, and of these found 11.5% had descriptions of open data and only 1.5% of code. So again, we're seeing fairly low levels of data reporting in articles. However, in a sense, all is not lost, and there is the ability to change author behaviour and to see developments in this area. And so this graph is describing all of the articles published in the BMC journals from around 2000. And so you can see between 2000 and 2015, there were no DASs, no data availability statements in journals, more or less. But then in 2015, the BMC journals mandated that a DAS was necessary. Authors had to provide one to publish. And you can see very quickly a change in behaviour that not 2 or 3 years later, there was a fantastic uptake that some sort of data availability statement was included in the articles. And so author behaviour can be changed and changed quite quickly. I don't want to forget as well about the researchers, and we have to then sometimes, I think, well, why are we doing this? And I know there are 2 talks coming, so I won't spend much time on this, but just a quick survey shows that data and data sharing is leading to the facilitation of research. Fu et al. This year have looked at cancer tissue classification. Teriyama looked at materials discovery. So researchers really are using the data that's being shared. And I think interestingly, there's actually a whole journal now, ACM Transactions on Knowledge Discovery from Data, that is going to studying how much knowledge is discovered from data. So things really are developing in this area. Finally, in terms of products and implementation, on top of all of these developments, there are now efforts to actually track the use. And so I think we heard about the Data Citation Index earlier. It's a Clarivate initiative to try and track what citations are made. There are also community groups launching services to try and track this. So Make Data Count initiative has recently been launched. I've got 5 minutes left. So in summary then for this section, which I'll quickly move on, but I think we can agree that the conceptual foundations have been laid. There's a rapidly developing technology and infrastructure. Policies are being established and implemented. Funders are mandating data deposition and sharing. There's a rapidly maturing progress in journal policy development. And so while implementation among global journals is uneven, many of the major publishers have moved in this way. On top of these, then products and services have been developed. And in terms of authors, author involvement is increasing and they're becoming more aware of the issues, but data deposition is still low. But I think because we're at early days, that can explain that. And so the next part is then, well, if we're convinced that research data is important, well, what can journals do about it? And what are the implications for journals and how do they go about implementing change? So I think the core issues here are that journals need to consider the issues and decide on their approach to data. And there are two main elements, data sharing and data citation, that need to be understood and looked at. And so as a journal, you'll need to review and revise your data policies and procedures with a mind to addressing the main questions, which is getting researchers to deposit and share data, getting researchers to cite the data and the data sets, and then getting your journal's policies and infrastructure in place. If we take a conceptual, broad strategic view, there are a range of policy options which journals can consider and use this as a guiding roadmap to their approach to the data, research data area for their journals. So journals can make no statement of requirements. They can state that there are no requirements. They can encourage action, expect action, or then mandate action and potentially check compliance with that mandate. And so you need to answer the question yourselves, what do you want your journal to require? Other considerations are that if you can answer these three main questions, you really will be well on your way to developing a data policy for your journal. And so will your journal encourage, expect, or mandate data availability statements, or none of these? Will you peer review the data? And will you implement data citation guidelines? And so there are two very important papers here, which have been recently published, which I encourage you to read to really get a full understanding of this area. They're fantastic roadmaps for you. If we look at the Herr and Askowitz paper just briefly, they did a lot of work, especially with the Research Data Alliance, and had a large group involved to try and lay out a range of different policies from low stringency to high stringency against a whole range of different elements. And I'm just putting this here for illustrative purposes today, but they have laid out a fantastic foundation for journals to use to help them through this process of implementing change in the research data for their journals. And so in practical terms, what do you need to do to implement change? Well, you need to decide upon your policy positions. You need to update your instructions to authors, make changes to Scholar One and other manuscript tracking systems as you have. You need to train editors and editorial staff in any of the changes that are being caused, and communicate to authors and reviewers and others depending on what your policies are. And then there will be some changes to the journal and workflow. So you might add a DAS section to your article. You might have to change, or you will have to change the underlying JATS XML and some of the linking of your articles. And then you need to monitor author compliance with your policies. In terms of data citation, so is the other side of this. We have data sharing and then data citation. The key issues in this area to resolve are to understand any requirements for authors to appropriately cite the data. You need to decide on your citation style and format. You need to decide if there are any requirements for peer reviewers to check these citation practices. And you need to also understand and instigate changes to the article structure in XML DTD, much like the data sharing, and also look at the delivery of metadata to different organizations. And so I'll finish on this slide, which is a recent study by Kolovitsa, actually et al. From this year. And they did a study which showed that when articles included a data availability statement and links to data, that there was a predicted 25% increase in average citation rate for those papers. And so I think this summarizes nicely what we're looking at today, which is that if journals can understand the foundations and the foundational conceptual changes that are going on and see the developments in infrastructure and policy, and if they then implement these changes to their journals, they might see an advantage in one way or another to their journals, apart from obviously helping science itself. And on that, I will say thank you and stop.
ありがとうございます。マグラッシャンさん、ありがとうございました。それでは質疑応答に入ります。一つご質問いただいてます。個人によっているうちはなかなか大変ですなという感想的な